Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev. And today what I want to talk about is how to set up and deploy an Express React project. Because generally when you're doing an Express, like an Express API, and then you're doing a separate React application, what you're doing is you're creating two projects, two applications, so they generally should be two repositories. There are things called mono repos you can do, but generally that's going to be more advanced and more for more complicated projects that for your basic Express React app, you really rather just do one repository with your Express app, which is your backend, and one repository with your front end React app. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set one up from scratch and deploy it. We'll do like a one route Express app just to kind of illustrate the point, and we'll go from there. So what I'm going to do, first thing I would do is I just create a folder for my project. So I'm going to click on VS Code. I'm going to do open folder, and I'm going to go through just where I make folders. So this is for a video single. So I'm going to make the project here, and we'll just call this React Express. That's what I'll call the folder. It doesn't matter what the folder is called. And then I'm going to open up that folder in VS Code. So I'm going to start here. Because first I want to do is just set up both things. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set up a backend folder. The backend folder I can just create. I don't need to do anything fancy there. For the front end folder, I'm going to want to create a React app. So I'm going to do npx create React app front end. So I know that folder is my front end app. Okay, so that is going to, I gotta always do the add latest select because my npm for some reason eternally caches an older version of create React app, which no matter how many times I do a global uninstall, never adjusts itself. Okay, so that's going to set up the React app. So in the meantime, what I'll do is I'll open up a second terminal. So I'm going to open up a second terminal. And this terminal, I'm going to cd into the backend folder. Okay, so you can see here, I'm in the backend folder. Okay, so from here, I'm going to initiate a Git repo. So I'm not initiating a Git repo in React Express. I'm initiating a repo in backend, Git init. Okay, so there's the repo. Okay, and then I'll do all the stuff to kind of set up Express. So I'm just going to open up this folder over here. And in this folder, I am going to touch a server.js. Yeah, server.js. Then I'm going to do an npm init -y to create my package.json. Then I'm going to install Express. And I want to install cores because at minimum you do need cores to the React app to talk to the Express app. And we'll leave it at that. Again, I'm not going to build anything crazy. Cool. So you see there's my backend app. And again, notice my terminal is in the backend folder. But again, I have another terminal open, so let me go back and check there. Okay, that React app is finished generating. Okay. Was it still going? There we go. Oh, that terminal kind of went all bonkers, so I'm just going to trash it. Create another terminal. Now this terminal, I'm going to cd into my front end folder. And notice, see, my front end folder is already a repo. Like if I do a git status in here, I never initiated a repo in this front end folder. Create React app. When it generates your React project, see, I never created the front end folder. React did. It's already going to be a repo. Okay. Which is why I wanted to make sure that the folder that I made it in was not a repo. Okay. So the idea is that the folder that has the backend and front end folder is not a repo. Backend is one repo, front end is another. Okay, but let me just create this Express app real quick. So now, if you want to use the like GitHub features of VS Code, what I'd recommend is then like reopening the window. So I click here, open folder, and I'm just gonna go open it. Go to React Express and open up the backend folder by itself. So that way, it's just that repo. It's just gonna make it easier for VS Code to know what it's working with because you're opened up to the folder where that specific repo was initiated. Okay, so here I am. Right now, all I see is the backend folder, and I always know what folder I have open because it's listed right there. Okay, so from there, I'm going to open up my terminal. I am going to set up my scripts. Always important to set up that start script because by default, any deployment service that's deploying your Node app is going to assume you have a start script. Okay, so basically, if you don't specify what the run command is, it's just going to assume npm start. So if you have npm start ready to go, then you don't have to think about it. So generally the production script should be start, and it should just generally be node server.js because that's the file we're building our server in. Again, if I were developing locally, I'd probably want to use Nodemon. If you actually have newer versions of Node, you could actually do this. Node watch server.js, and it actually works just like Nodemon without having to install Nodemon. So that's pretty cool. But let's just create our Express app real quick. So again, I just bring in Express, const express equals require Express. Then I want to create, and then I want to actually make sure I bring in cores. Const cores equals require cores. And we're just going to also declare the port variable while I'm at it. Port equals, generally I want it to equal process.env.port. But let's say I didn't define that environmental variable. Then we'll use 3000. We'll make it 4000. Okay, and yeah, so we'll create our app variable. So const app equals express. That's our express application. I'm going to register my middleware, which the only middleware I really care about is cores. And then I'm going to write a route, app.use. We'll just make this a route for this will just work for any route. So the asterisk just means literally anything. So it's a catch-all. Okay. So it'll work for everything. And actually, no, that's not what I want to do. App.get. Rec res. And what I want to do here is res.json. I'm going to send over some JSON data. And we're just going to say, we're going to send a JavaScript object with a property called name. And name is AlexMerced. That's it. That's literally all it's going to do. Then we got to make sure the server turns on. So the app's got to listen, which it should listen on the port that's specified by the port variable. Then we're going to want to call back just to kind of print out some text so we know the server is listening. So console.log, listening on port, and I'm going to use interpolation to put the port number in the variable. Okay, so first I always want to test things out locally, make sure that the code works locally. Okay, it just helps me isolate what's the possible problems. So if I type in node, well, I'll try my skips out first. So npm run dev. Okay, there it's running. Let's go to localhost 4000. Cool, that works. And again, it should pretty much work for anything I type. See, it's gonna work because I put that catch-all route. I use that asterisk, so it works for anything I send it to. Because again, I'm not building a whole full-fledged API here. Cool. So this works. It's done. Okay, there's nothing I need. All I need is my package.json and my server.js. And in my server.js, well, a couple things. Again, you always need to deploy. You need to make sure that you work off that port variable because all deployment services generally assign your application a port through that port variable. So you want to make sure that like, hey, that's how your app works. And for Node apps, you want to make sure that there's a start script that's initiated. Because if you don't have a start script in there, by default, Node generally generates a start script that just runs Node, whatever the main is. And if you didn't have a file created before you did npm init-y, it's going to assume it's going to be index.js. So best thing to do is always make sure you define your start script. And your start script is the command you want to run to start your app. Okay? Okay, but with that, we want to get this on the GitHub. So what I'll do is I'll just do a git add dot. But let's say I'm using, GitHub. I'm using VS Code. I would just go over here and say, hey, I want to add all changes. Then put a message, first commit, then commit. Now what I want to do is publish the branch, but I got to add a remote. So I'm going to go over here to remotes, and I'm going to hit plus. But I got to, add a name. We'll call it origin. And I need a URL. So I'm going to head over to GitHub. GitHub.com. Lost my voice this weekend, so I sound a little rough. Okay, but this will be, Express React backend, we'll call it. And we'll put today's date on it. So 010823. Okay, just because I've done this so many times. That's fine. Okay, and again, this is the URL that I need to pass. So I'm going to grab that. Because the idea is like, what repo is it pushing to? I want it to push to this repo. Okay, so see now that remote is listed there. And now what I want to do is I want to push to that remote. So let's see here. I think you just click publish branch and it should publish it. Okay. Nah, I can do that myself. Okay. So now if I refresh this, the code should be there. There's the code. Then I'm going to head over to render.com. You could also use Railway. There's a bunch of different choices out there. But I'll head to my dashboard. Since this is back end, first I got to log in. But since this is back end, you want to deploy it as a web service. If you were to deploy a React app, you'd want to deploy that as a static site. Okay, so front end, back end, front end, back end, other things for other purposes. Okay, so we're going to load up our repositories for our new web service. Takes a second. There it is. So there's the repo. So I'm going to connect that. Okay, we'll just call this Express React back 080123. Okay, and deploying Basis Node app. There's no build command because the app doesn't need to be built, so that can be ignored. And then there's the start command. So again, you want to make sure this is the command that's going to run your app. So it's referring to the right file. I like doing npm start, so that was dictated by my start script. Okay, use the free tier, create web service, and now it's just going to go generate the service. Okay, so that will take a second. So I'll let that build. But the idea is that essentially when it's done, this will be the deployment URL here. Okay, so we'll come back to that. Now let's head over to React. So now that that's done, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open, let me just double check one thing. Cores, yep, good. Okay, so now what I'll do is I'll head over to open folder, and now I'm going to go open my front end folder. Okay, and work on my React app. Okay, and let's see here. I will do a new terminal. Let's start up my React app. npm start. Okay, and we're gonna use React Router. So I'm gonna open up a separate terminal because I forgot to install React Router. So npm install React Router DOM. So that's gonna install. Okay, then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create a file called router.js. Okay, and we're gonna set up our routers here. So I'm gonna say const. Actually, it's import create browser router, and I want to import create routes from elements. Okay, so again, this is going to create our router for React Router. So the idea is that we need every router provider, the thing that actually powers router in your app, needs this router object to know what your routes are. It's like, okay, what are your routes? Well, that's what this is. So const router equals create browser router. That's the function that creates the router object. But we're not going to pass it a JavaScript object. We want to define our routes through JSX. So we use create routes from elements. And then from there, we actually do need the route component. So let me go bring that in. Okay, and then I can write my routes. So let's just do that. And we're just going to have one route, which is going to be generating our app component. So let me import app. /app. Okay, so route, which is going to have a path of slash. Actually, I think I can do this, and that also works as a catch-all. We'll test it out. Okay, element, which is going to equal whatever you want to show up when that route is active. So what I want to show when that route is active is the app component. And that's good for now. We're just going to have this one route. Again, keeping this simple. And then we want to export that router. Export default router. Okay, so now that I have done that, what I want to do is I need to go set up that router on my app. So I'm going to bring in, I don't really need the app component in here right now. It's going to complain, whatever. But we're going to import router provider. That's going to be the thing that that basically makes router work for the application. And then we're going to also import the router lowercase that we just created. And then essentially going to replace this call to app here with router provider. Now this router provider basically is what's updating the page every time the URL changes, but it doesn't know what the routes are. So I need to pass it a router. So that way it knows what the routes are. So it knows what to render. Okay, and there we go. We're back up and running because it knows for pretty much I could actually literally type anything here. And it's going to show me that. Why? Because again, if we take a look at our router, I did the asterisk, which is anything. Okay, it's a catch-all. It just means literally anything. Okay, so that's all well and good. Okay, now let's just go double check our API, see if it's up and running. So I click on this, and look, good, it's working. Okay, so I'm going to copy over this URL. Okay, and what I'm going to want to do is say, hey, when app loads, I want to go fetch this data. So since I'm using React Router, there's a really easy way to do this using a loader function. So I like to organize all my loaders into a full file called loaders.js. And I generally name them after the component that they're loading for. So in that case, I would do export const app loader, since it's going to be loading for the app component. And I don't need any information from the arguments, so all I really need to do here, and I want to make this an async function, so that way I can use async await. So that way that syntax is easy to write. And I'm going to go make the fetch call. So I'm just going to do const the response equals fetch to this URL. And then I got to make sure I await that. Okay, so that'll wait for the fetch to finish. Once the fetch finishes, this will receive the response object, but I want the data. So the data comes from running response.json. That takes the response object and then interprets the body of the response as JSON, and then returns you the JavaScript object that results from that. Okay, and then I want to return that data. Okay, and there you go. And again, notice I just wrote export, not export default. So that's called a named export. So now if I go back to my router, I can import this function. So I can import app loader. And then I can add it to that route as a loader. So I'll say, hey, the loader for this route is app loader. And whenever that route loads in React, it's going to run that function, which right now doesn't generate any kind of visible thing. But if we go to our app component and I use the import use loader data hook, I can then bring in that data. So we'll just say const data equals use loader data. And whatever that function returns, I can then get here. So now if I console, well, let's just do this. And we know that that object only has one property in it, a name. So basically it would just be data.name. Okay, and there it is, Alex Merced. It's getting that from our API call. Because again, our API returns an object with a property called name, which the value was Alex Merced. Okay, so our app is working, it's pulling from our deployed API, and now to deploy the application, I could use render. So if I were to use render, I would just go back to render and hit new, click a new static site, but first I gotta get it up to GitHub. So I have to head over to GitHub first. I gotta make another repo. Why? because one repo for the back end, one repo for the front end. So I'm just going to copy the same name, go over here and say I want another repo. Next, I'm going to change this one to front end. And then again, I'm going to copy the URL. Then I'm going to head over to the little GitHub thing, go over to remotes. I'm going to go add this remote. So I'm going to say we're going to call it origin. You should always call your original remote origin and say, hey, origin points to this URL. Okay, now I can add all my changes, say first commit, make the commit, and then publish that to GitHub. Okay, now that's all going to be visible. But now, so now when I go over here to here, I can refresh this. I'm going to refresh this. So that way it will load the repo, including that new repo that we just created. And like, look at my repos. So notice, see, like package.json's right there on top. If I look at the React repo, package.json's right there on top. That should always be how your repos look like. Because when you use any service like Render, Heroku, whatever, basically what happens is that you connect a repo to it, and all it does is take a look at that top level. If it doesn't find a file that gives it direction in that first level, it just is like, I don't know what to do with this. So if it doesn't see a package.json for a Node app, or a gem file for a Ruby app, or a requirements.txt for a Python app, it's just going to be like, I don't know what you want me to do here. I can't pick up on what kind of app am I setting up. And it's not going to go look through all your folders to figure that out. Okay, so it's got to be that top level. So that's why one project, one repo. Okay, but yeah, so let's go back to render. See, there's the repo for my front end. I'm going to connect it. Okay, Express React, except this is going to be front now. And I want to deploy the main branch, that's fine. Technically, if you did have like your project in a nested directory, this is where you would take care of that. So like if you had a folder inside your folder, you could paint the path here. You can be like, oh, it's actually inside the /frontend folder or something. I'd avoid that. It just makes things more complicated. Okay, it generally realizes I have a React app. It'll notice these things, so it's automatically going to assume that it has to run the build command first, which would be like npm run build, yarn build. Yarn is just an alternative to npm. It doesn't matter. It knows what to do. And then basically for React, when you run the build command, it publishes all your code to a folder called build. So see, it already knows. So I don't have to change anything. So I just create the static site, and it's going to start building it, which will take a second. And then we'll pretty much be up and running. Okay, but just to show you like what the build command does, because you can run build locally. I can just do like here, like npm run build. It builds the app, and see, it creates like this build folder, which actually has your application. So technically, this is what's being deployed. So what's actually being deployed by, Render, Vercel, Netlify is the output of this build folder. And if you look in here, you'll see like in this folder. So let me see here. In this folder, you see there's an index.html. That's what's, and it looks like gibberish, but that's what the browser's loading up. And then here's like all your JavaScript and your CSS all compiled here by Webpack. Okay, so it's not like your fancy code that's inside that source folder that's being deployed. It's this built output run by the bundling process. Okay, so it's still setting up the code. I'll just pause this. Once that's done, we'll show you the final result. Okay, so now it's done. So now I can just click here to see the React app. Oh yeah, that's right, because I cleared it out. Oh, wait, failed to fetch. Let's see why. This app has been blocked by CORS. Ah, we have a CORS error. Not porque. Okay, I think I know why. Okay. Okay, this is to do with Render wants you to have a specific you have to make sure you put the right URL in there. So basically what I have to do is I'm going to go to node npm.js.com because I always forget this exact setting. You just look up the CORS middleware. Because it basically, I think if I remember right, like render will reject a blanket. Hey, anyone is allowed for security purposes. It's for good security purposes. So that means you just have to make sure that you whitelist the URL specifically. Okay, so that's just going to require me to do the following. So let me just open this up. My computer's being slow. Okay, well, while that's set up, I just will go ahead over here, but head back to our backend because we're going to have to make that adjustment. Because anytime you're dealing with cores, cores is always dealt with from the backend. The front end can't do much about cores. Because it's the backend that's saying, hey, these are the people who are allowed to request to my server. So we head back to the backend. Okay, and see, there's cores. That's all fine and good. I just have to make sure that I put in some specific cores policies. Because see, this just gives a blanket, you know, whatever. It just says, hey. So usually the way we would do that, okay, I could also just deploy the netlify and Vercel, which won't have that deal. But basically we want this. So see this little code snippet right here. I just want to copy that. And I'll just kind of put that right over here. Because the idea is that this whitelist array is the array of websites that are allowed to make a request to this API. So what I want to do is just make sure that I put the front end URL in there. So let me just go find that. So here it is. Here's the URL for the front end. So I'm going to copy that, put that in here. Okay, good. Get rid of that other URL. So basically, only that URL can make a request to the front end. Okay, and that's all good. And again, this thing right here is a function that will use that array to figure out, like, hey, is this thing. So you just pass that into here, cores options, like that. Because again, cores options is this variable that we declared right over here. And again, this cores options object has one property called origin, which is a function. Basically, what the function does, the origin is the URL that's making the request. So it's saying, hey, given this URL is making the request, let me check if that URL is in the array. And if it's not in the array, it returns this, which returns the cores error. And if that URL is not in the array, it returns this. Okay, so that should fix it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just push it up. So pushy, I have a special custom command that I made, update origin main, that just makes pushing stuff up real easy because it's all in one command. So that's pushing up. I'm going to wait for that to redeploy, and I will pause this for now while that does that. Okay, looks like the deployment is live. So let me go back to our React app, the deployed one, and let me refresh. And now it works. There we go. Okay, so just keep in mind that you do need to make sure you set up the cores permissions if you deploy to render. I think just the empty cores works fine for like Vercel or Netlify. So if you want to deploy your front end to Vercel or Netlify, which is the same process, you just connect the repo and it's done. Then you probably don't have to do that extra step there. So probably the best match is to deploy your backend on render and then deploy your front end on Netlify or Vercel. But again, if you do it on render, which you can, just make sure you go back and set up those cores options. And again, you can find that from the cores documentation. So you just head over to npmjs.com, look up the cores library, and then just read the directions. And again, you'll find this clip here, and you just copy and paste that and just put the URL in there, and then make sure you pass the cores options. Okay, that's it. I'll see y'all later. Have a good one. Ciao.